In an election year, the state of the economy is always a prime issue. As the next federal election approaches, the Howard government can boast managing one of the best economic periods in Australia's history, with strong growth, low unemployment, a budget surplus and interest rates, in relative terms, that are fairly moderate. The opposition claims that the present state of the economy is due to Labor's re-engineering of policy during its reign in the 1980s and 90s, and that, if back in power, it could not only manage the economy well, but also improve on issues such as workplace relations. To talk more about this is Andrew Charlton, who joins me in the studio. He's a Rhodes Scholar with a doctorate from Oxford, and he's an economist at the London School of Economics and author of the new book, Ozonomics, and he's back on home shores. Andrew Charlton, thanks for coming in.
Thanks very much.
Now, firstly, I'll do a mea culpa for the media. We're reporting economic facts and figures, consumer prices, gold prices and all that sort of thing. Now, you argue that judging the state of the economy really kind of has nothing to do with a lot of those things, and that we just become part of the noise, and that that's not central to what we should be knowing about. Is that right?
Well, I think there's a lot of economic information out there. People are bombarded with news about the current account deficit and inflation and interest rates. And it's quite difficult to understand what that really means and what the real priorities are in the economy and what will affect our lives and what won't. So in the book, I argued that most of that is sort of secondary, and there are really only three things that matter in the economy. And if you understand those things, then you probably understand more than a lot of the people who run the economy on your behalf.
Okay, and those three things?
Those three things are productivity, employment and equality. And if you think about it, it sort of makes sense. So productivity is really just how much each person produces, and then employment is how many people are in the economy producing, and then equality is sort of how that's shared around. So if productivity is high and employment is high, then you have total national output, which is high. And if that's shared around, then everything else in the economy will probably look after itself.
That sounds far too easy. You're taking away all of our jobs, including your own as an economist. Right. Now, on another issue, how can we judge, really, whether we're better off now than, say, 20 years ago?
Well, I think we certainly are better off now. That's clear. The question that I think Australians need to ask, particularly in the lead up to an election, is why are we better off? Is it a matter of luck? Is it a matter of good economic management on the part of the government? Is it a matter of benign international economic forces? And if we understand those questions more clearly, then we can get a better sense of what we need to do to sustain that prosperity into the future.
Well, as I started out in the introduction saying, you know, in an election year, interest rates and managing the economy becomes absolutely central. Now, the Coalition have often argued, with electoral success, that they are the better economic managers, and that, on the one hand, and that interest rates stay lower under them. Now, is there real evidence for them to be able to say that, in your view?
Well, I think unquestionably the Liberal government has presided over a period of extraordinary economic stability and growth, and that's something that all Australians should be proud of. But it's a little more complex than to say that just because the economy is growing strongly, that means that the government in power at that time must have caused the economy to grow strongly in that way. It's a little more complex than that, because a good economy is the product of reforms that were implemented decades ago, benign economic international forces, and a lot of luck.
Yeah.
So Australia's sort of been at the fulcrum of many of those different forces, and it's important, I think, for people to try and untangle exactly what it is that's produced the boom and what it is that might just be coincidental.
So in one sentence, can you say what has produced the boom? And say, let's stay with the political side. Surely the Coalition and Labor have both contributed to it over the past 20 years? I
think that's absolutely true. That there's no question that the previous, in terms of Australia's economic history, the previous Labor government in the 1980s and early 1990s wholly transformed the Australian economy. They took us from essentially a waning sheltered workshop on the edge of the world into a dynamic and modern economy. And that was an incredible achievement for a government.
Okay, well now just fairly briefly, because we're going to run out of time, industrial relations is shaping up to be a very big battleground in this election. Beyond the political rhetoric, how much of an impact have the Howard government's new IR laws had on both productivity and creating new jobs?
Well, I think everyone realises that we have to have a dynamic and flexible labour market. Without that, we can't have a dynamic and flexible economy. But in my view, there are two ways to create a dynamic labour market. One is, as the Howard government has done, by reducing some of the regulation on the labour market, and making it easier to hire and fire workers, and by reducing some of the safeguards and unfair dismissal legislation. And another one which I'm sort of drawn to more myself is promoting workers' ability to have choices in the labour market, to improving their human capital, training them, supporting their flexibility, and enabling them to move between jobs and between industries as they require. So I think there are sort of two ways to do it, and I'd be inclined to shift slightly more towards the latter.
Okay, very quickly, and just turning to the global stage, is the Doha round achievable to get more reform in there?
I think the Doha round has been a big disappointment for everyone involved. Part of the problem has been a mismatch of expectations versus reality. The Doha round began in 2001, and the world was promised a round which would radically transform the relationship between rich and poor countries. Poor countries were told that they would get a round which promoted their interests and brought them out of poverty. And unfortunately, as is often the way in multilateral negotiations, the developed countries, the rich countries of the world, have stepped back from that and tried to promote their own self-interest and tried to step away from some of the commitments that they made. And in doing so, a lot of the developing countries, I guess, have found that they're not happy with the round anymore and have walked away from it.
Andrew Charlton, we'll leave it there, but thanks for coming in to chat.
Thank you very much, Helen.